There's little question that Boston's housing costs are very high, with a large gap in income that's getting wider. Community advocates are making new efforts to make housing more affordable. One recent effort was a hearing before the City Council to tell us about the Right to Remain campaign, or the community organizer for sustainable economic development with the W Street Neighborhood Initiative, Eliza, and a program associate from the Boston Tenant Coalition, Kadineyse, Ramize, Peña. Thank you both very much for being with us.
Thanks.
I'll start with Kadineyse. Talk about what tenants in Boston are faced with right now in terms of the costs and I guess the way property owners are dealing with this market.
So at the moment, the rent is extremely high compared to what people are earning in income. I think that 53.3% is what has increased in rent since 1998. And 5 of the most affordable neighborhoods in Boston, which would be in Hyde Park, Mattapan, Roxbury, East Boston, and Dorchester, 3 of those have actually increased tremendously from 2012 to 2013. So it's something a lot that people have to deal with in this time, and it's super hard to find affordable housing, especially with all new development. You would assume, oh, I would be able to find something, but it's getting increasingly harder.
Eliza, about 30 years ago, when the W Street Neighborhood Initiative was getting started, there were both fears of gentrification and at the same time a lot of really deterioration that this neighborhood had to deal with too. And DSNA has come a long way since then. But how do things stand now? Is it now difficult for people to stay in that neighborhood?
Well, so 25 years ago, we created the Dudley Neighbors Inc. Community Land Trust, and there's 225 units of housing on the Community Land Trust itself. So for those folks, they have affordable either home ownership, rental, or co-op housing in perpetuity that they can also pass on to future generations. So that group of people is really stable in the neighborhood. In terms of housing that's not on the land trust, the gentrification wave is coming down the line, really from Dudley Square and from downtown Boston and Back Bay, which are a mile away from the neighborhood that we work in. Recently, starting this year, there's been developers proposing market rate rents that are very much out of the range of residents in the neighborhood, proposing as high as $2,200 for a studio or a single bedroom, when the average 3-bedroom rent is still around $2,000.
$2,200 for even a studio, and $2,200 a month, right? Mm-hmm. Who would have thought? Right. Yeah. The other thing about here is the tenants in terms of their protections. I mean, right now what's going to happen is if a property changes hands, especially a new owner is going to say, well, I have to pay a higher mortgage bill every month. I've got to come up on the rents. And where does that leave the tenants exactly?
It doesn't leave them very much option. There's something that's called the just cause eviction that hasn't really been put in place, but is super needed right now. It helps stop landlords from taking tenants out of their apartments just because they feel like they could use that apartment or put up their rents for their own benefit. So it doesn't leave residents a lot of options. We get a lot of calls every day sort of looking for help. Oh, I have a landlord that's raising my rent so much higher than what it used to be. I have complaints, and so there aren't a lot of organizations or places to go for these tenants.
So if you were to change the law, how much more power would you give tenants in a situation like that?
I think they would get a lot more power. I don't know specifically how much exactly. I haven't been working on this for very long, but I think that having any control as a tenant, I think, is super important when you're dealing with landlords at this time.
Eliza, the land trust model worked out by W Street Neighborhood Initiative, maybe it wasn't originally about keeping the neighborhood affordable, but it's a tool because you've got vacant land or sometimes even a whole building, and instead of an investor owner coming in to maximize profits, there's another alternative. How does this work exactly?
Right, so the goal originally of the land trust was in order to keep homes affordable for perpetuity for the ground lease. That's an agreement between the land, which is owned by the Community Land Trust, and the structure or improvement, as it's called in Community Land Trust lingo, on the land. So the improvement can be anything from a single family or a 2-family home to rental units. And like I said, there's 225 units of affordable housing that's a split between home ownership and rental and co-op units. And so it can be used in any neighborhood, and it can also be used to maintain green spaces, parks, urban farms, things like that that we have on the land trust. But really, the most important tool and what it's most widely used for across the country is preserving affordable housing through deed restrictions that are included in the ground lease.
What's the next step? Because there are people saying we ought to do more of this in Chinatown. Maybe there are other neighborhoods where people would like to see it happen. So how do you make that kind of a thing happen?
It takes time, and it takes having a strong resident base and people who want to get involved in both planning the vision for the future of your neighborhood as well as fighting for it and preserving that vision throughout time. But we actually are working with about 8 organizations right now around Greater Boston who are considering starting a land trust, and we're really excited to say that Chinatown Community Land Trust launched in January of 2015. Although they don't have any property yet, they have the board structure and they're ready to acquire land. And there's another emerging land trust in the Four Corners neighborhood that we've been working very closely with. So there isn't any policy stopping land trusts from getting started. They can start right now. Really, the biggest barrier is that we're in the market competing with cash buyers and private developers who are bidding on the same land that we are, which is part of the reason that we're asking the city to prioritize any city-owned land for community land trusts or nonprofit affordable housing that is community controlled.
Kadineyse, there's one other idea, I'm sure this was talked about at the hearing as well, having developers, especially developers putting up those very large projects, set aside more for affordable housing.
So right now the amount for set aside is $200,000, and that's based off of the subsidy that the BRA would have given them. We're trying to really get them to put in what it would cost to build an affordable unit in that neighborhood. It accumulates to a lot better or more units, because if someone's building something in Fenway, it's a lot more expensive than if they're doing something on in Rexbury. So we're really trying to make sure we get the value out of the developers for these affordable units.
Now, some people say instead of having them subsidize very deeply in that more desirable neighborhood, at least as far as the market goes, why not let them provide affordable units in other neighborhoods where they might be able to provide even a larger number?
I think it's about creating diversity, economic diversity, and cultural diversity in neighborhoods. When you put a lot of the socioeconomic people together, then it doesn't create a lot of diversity for people. And then it's also, Fenway and Chinatown are becoming luxury landmarks right now. And that's something that's not beneficial for the city nor for the residents. So it's not necessarily that we don't want them to build in Roxbury or Dorchester. It's more of keeping the city diverse in all socioeconomic, cultural, class-wise.
Thank you both very much. Kadineyse, Ramize, Peña, and Eliza. Thank you very much. We'll have more news in just a moment.